Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. The Kingdom of Bahrain is the smallest country in the Middle East. It is an island in the Persian Gulf connected to Saudi Arabia by a causeway, and it is home to a very large U.S. naval base. Bahrain is also in the midst of a years-long crackdown in which political opposition figures, human rights defenders, journalists, and bloggers have been languishing in jail. And it was in this context that last month, Bahrain held elections that were a total sham, according to my guest today, Brian Dooley. Brian Dooley is a senior advisor at Human Rights First, and as he explains, the politics and international relations of Bahrain can teach us a lot about broader trends in the Middle East. In our conversation, we discuss why these recent elections in Bahrain matter and what the international community can do to restore a semblance of representative democracy to Bahrain, and why what happens in Bahrain matters in the Middle East and around the world. I found this conversation to be a useful discussion about a topic and an issue, democracy and the retreat of democracy in Bahrain that does not get the kind of attention it deserves, but I'm glad to shine a spotlight on it. Brian Dooley also recently wrote a policy brief for the Project on Middle East Democracy about this very issue, and I'll post a link to his article on globaldispatchespodcast.com. And as always, a big thank you to those of you who are premium subscribers and have become premium subscribers to the show recently and have unlocked a host of rewards, including bonus episodes and my daily global news clip service. To learn more about these rewards that you unlock by becoming a premium subscriber, go to globaldispatchespodcast.com. And again, feel free to email me anytime using the contact button on the homepage. Love hearing from you guys. All right, now here is my conversation with Brian Dooley from Human Rights First.
So Bahrain is the smallest country in the Middle East. It's just off the coast of Saudi Arabia, and it sits really between Saudi Arabia and Iran on that Strait of Hormuz, which makes it immediately then in a difficult, sensitive, politically region. It has about 1.5 million people who live there, although half of those or more are actually not native Bahrainis. They are people who are from overseas who are working there for one reason or another. A lot of domestic workers, a lot of labourers, and then at the other end of the social scale, you have a lot of people working there in finance and banking. It's always been a slight oddity. It's, as I say, it's sandwiched really between Saudi and Iran, but the other big powerful neighbour in the region, its other big powerful neighbour is the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. And for a long time, really for generations, Bahrain has at least had a reputation for being slightly more liberal than its other Gulf counterparts. Sort of a petri dish, if you like, where some or the bigger players could see how liberalization might work, how limited political reform might work, how a certain degree of religious pluralism might work. And so it's been this sort of hotbed for some time of sort of experimenting of, what would it look like in this context, in this region for one of the smallest, in fact, the smallest Gulf states to have a little degree of political inclusiveness.
And so they've had a parliament that for a time also included parties from its large Shia minority as well, correct?
In fact, the Shia population there is the majority, again, which also sets it apart from the other Gulf states. The other Gulf states have a majority Sunni population. Bahrain's population is actually majority Shia, but
Was it about like what, like 60% or so or more?
yeah, it's hard to know because they won't do a census, but somewhere between 60 and 70%, 65-ish% is generally thought of as being about a sensible guesstimate for the Shia to Sunni population there.
But the Sunnis are the ones who have typically and historically held the bulk of wealth and power in the country, correct?
Yeah, completely. I mean, the country really, despite the elections, is really run by a ruling family and their cronies, all of whom are Sunnis. They're a Sunni family backed by a powerful political Sunni elite. And so there's always been that fault line in Bahrain's politics too, where you really, if you talk about it in sectarian terms, and that's certainly not the only way to talk about it, but if you talk about it, characterize it by its sectarian nature, then you have a minority Sunni elite ruling over a majority Shia population. That's right.
And when did Bahrain become host to a large U.S. naval base? And it's, one of the sort of key strategic naval bases in the world for the United States for the geographic reasons you discussed earlier, sitting directly in the Strait of Hormuz.
That's right. And that's really a major part of the sensitivity about what happens in Bahrain. Despite its size, it has this really disproportionate political influence because the US has, for generations now, back to the 70s, had a sizable military base there, which has grown and grown and grown. Now it's home to the Fifth Fleet. The UK has just decided to sink also a large military base investment there in Bahrain. And so the stakes for the US and the UK are very high should something go wrong in Bahrain, should large-scale instability hit Bahrain for whatever reason. And so there are close eyes from the West on what's happening in Bahrain because really those powerful allies can't afford something to go disastrously wrong.
And so it is a very small country, as you said, yet because of its strategic location and because of its alliances with Saudi Arabia and the UAE and because of its relative wealth, it is a significant country and a geopolitically strategic and important country in the world, frankly.
Yeah, although actually it's not that rich. It really depends for its wealth on Saudi and the Emirates, and it doesn't produce its own oil. It sort of has a lease arrangement with Saudi Arabia, and its fiscal deficit is really heading towards a pretty disastrous place. It's running a huge public debt. The IMF says that for Bahrain to break even, the oil price, it refines oil, the oil price has to be around $100 a barrel, 110. And for some time now, it's been way below that. This week, it's around $50. Yeah. So Bahrain is looking more and more actually to its powerful neighbors to bail it out. And in fact, last month, there was a $10 billion package put together by its powerful neighbors, rich neighbors, Saudi and the Emirates, to bail it out. So it's not that rich, and certainly the government has mismanaged the economy, not least in terms of rooting out corruption. So it although it's in the Gulf, although it has that sort of petrodollar economy, it's not a wealthy place.
And as you said, it seems pretty much entirely dependent or significantly dependent on Saudi Arabia and the UAE, its wealthier, larger neighbors, to prop it up, both economically, but also through security guarantees as well. And so it's in that context that I wanted to have you discuss the recent elections in Bahrain, which were sort of a complete sham. And why were these elections held, and why were they a sham, and why does it matter that they were such a sort of false elections?
Well, Bahrain's reputation, again, is the least worst of the Gulf countries in terms of repression. A place where it's only one of two Gulf countries where there are some sort of elections, although I think Kuwait's actually a bit more meaningful. And so the elections are really just part of this PR push, this continued PR push for the Bahraini government to pretend that is, in any real sense, a constitutional monarchy. I mean, Britain technically is a constitutional monarchy in that, it has a fully functioning parliament and a head of state, which is a monarch. But in Bahrain, really, the monarch is the most powerful political figure. The cabinet is made up of appointees by the king. Usually around half of the cabinet are actually direct members of his family. His uncle has been the unelected prime minister of Bahrain since the early 70s, the longest serving prime minister in the world, never been elected. And so these parliamentary elections really are cosmetic. They will elect 40 people to sit in the lower chamber of Bahrain's parliament, the 40 members of the upper chamber also directly appointed by the king. And they'll talk about this and that a little bit, but they have no power in terms of deciding who's in the cabinet, removing cabinet members. They can't really bring legislation to a vote. And so they walk around, with the title of member of parliament, but it's pretty empty and meaningless. And really, the function of the elections is for Bahrain to pretend to anybody gullible enough that they're having some sort of democracy.
And reading your analysis of these elections, it seems that the big outcome of these elections was to disenfranchise the large Shia majority from even participating in elections to create a parliament that, as you said, is sort of powerless anyway. So why is it a big deal that sort of Shia have been excluded from the political system in Bahrain?
Right. So I wrote an analysis, you're right, for POMED, Project on Middle East Democracy, and in that I lay out why it matters. So a couple of election cycles ago, elections are held every 4 years, the opposition parties, not all of whom are Shia, but overwhelmingly are Shia, used to run candidates. And of course, the seats, even for this sort of make-up parliament, they were gerrymandered so that although you had a majority Shia population, really the Shia constituents could only ever elect 18 of the 40 seats. But nonetheless, there was a time when there would be up to that many opposition MPs. Again, their power was almost none, but it was a way for many of the population to be able to at least express and air grievances. Now, we've seen over the last 7 or 8 years since there were major protests against the government, which were violently cracked down on in 2011. One by one, really, these avenues of peaceful dissent have been shut down. The only independent newspaper was forced to close down last year. Human rights activists, civil societies have all been either silenced by pushed into exile or pushed into jail. And over the last year and a half or so, the opposition societies, they're not actually even allowed to be called parties, they have to be called opposition groups or societies, have been closed down, their leaders put in jail. And in fact, not only were they not allowed to run in the elections, anybody who'd ever been a member of one of these wasn't allowed to run in the elections. So part of this ongoing, ever-increasing repression was to close down that peaceful opposition voice.
And so you basically have the majority of the population who experience various forms of disenfranchisement and in some cases probably discrimination. And, the more prominent of whom have, been beaten, tortured, arrested, forced into exile, with no real sort of valve, no way of expressing their dissent. And so the concern is without these kind of peaceful forms that, unrest may come to this sort of vital U.S. ally.
Exactly. I think it was President Kennedy who said something like, the more you make peaceful evolution impossible, you make violent revolution inevitable. Something along those lines is really our concern, that if you shut off all other avenues for people to air their criticism, if you criticize the ruling family on social media, you get jailed. If you try to organize a protest, you get jailed. If you try to,
I've had a friend who was a journalist who went there and was arrested. Actually, she's been on this podcast. She told her story about getting arrested. Anna Therese Day is her name. About getting arrested in Bahrain 4 years ago, three or 4 years ago, just for the crime of doing journalism.
Right. And 7 or 8 years ago, international human rights organizations like my own used to be able to go into Bahrain and meet human rights activists. Those human rights activists, by and large, now are all in prison, and we are prevented from entering Bahrain. I tried to go in April this year and was held at the airport for 24, 25 hours. I mean, the human rights activists are not allowed out of the country to tell their story at the UN or elsewhere, at the US Congress, elsewhere, and international human rights organizations are not allowed in. And so, yeah, the fear is if you suffocate and you choke off all peaceful avenues of dissent, then some people, of course, will just give up, be intimidated into silence, but there are others who will. The fear is then others will turn to violent forms of dissent as the only way to express their grievances, and that's the problem. I mean, the ruling family in Bahrain clearly wants stability in the country, and so does everybody else. But I think the argument is about how you reach stability. We would say that a stability through repression can be won, but it's very temporary. I mean, we saw what happened in 2011 with Libya and Syria and Egypt and almost Bahrain itself.
Yeah, well, I wanted to talk about Bahrain's 2011 Arab Spring experience, because it seems that the repression following Bahrain's botched Arab Spring is something that has definitely sort of gotten worse. Can you talk a little bit about what happened during those protests and how Saudi Arabia was called to intervene and quash those protests and the repression that's been sort of ever growing ever steadier and ever more intense since then?
So inspired really by what was happening in Tunisia and especially Egypt. Bahraini protesters called for demonstrations on February the 14th, which is Bahraini National Day. And much to their surprise, tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of people came out to protest. And I think it's worth remembering that those early protests were not about sectarianism. These weren't Shia-driven protests. These were people, Sunni and Shia, who were complaining about a range of grievances, including corruption in the government, which I think if you look at some of the other uprisings in the region, you'll find corruption at the heart of those too. But anyway, what happened was there was initially a violent response from the government. Protesters were killed. And then there was a sort of an uneasy period of calm for about a month. But during that month, while negotiations were happening between government representatives and representatives of the protests and the political opposition, views on both sides, I think hardened, and by the middle of March, Saudi Arabia was really just fed up and decided that it couldn't allow these large-scale protests to go on its doorstep, because who knows where that contagion is going to lead, right? So it sort of called time on the negotiations and just sent in troops, as did the Emirates. Which really gave the signal to the local Bahraini security forces to run amok, basically. I mean, they rounded up thousands of people. Some of you may remember some of the bigger cases were, dozens of medics who had treated injured protesters themselves were then arrested and tortured and put in crazy military trials and given long sentences and so on. The response to that internationally then was relatively strong. Even the UK and the US started to get uncomfortable about the way that the process had been put down so brutally. And so towards the end of 2011 and early 2012, there were all sorts of promises made by the Bahraini government. They brought in an independent panel of international lawyers to recommend, this is the way you should reform. They promised to do it and then just didn't. And partly they didn't because the US and the UK and some of the other big players, but notably those, really decided that they had bigger things to worry about. And when they took the pressure off of the Bahraini government, it went not just back to business as usual, but actually back to business far worse than it had been before in many ways.
So even as it seems the Bahraini government was increasing their repression following the failed Arab Spring, the U.S. government, in this case the Obama administration, didn't really do much to support Bahraini political activists, and rather sort of doubled down on their support of the Bahraini government?
Right. The Obama administration really said some fairly inconsistent and contradictory things. It imposed an arms blockade and a ban on arms sales to Bahrain military, and then lifted that, even though there really hadn't been much human rights progress. It made a fuss about some things, but generally the signal was, if the Bahrainis decide to imprison their human rights activists, there isn't that much that the US administration is going to do about it. And remember, of course, during the Obama administration, one of the big prizes for it was to secure the Iran deal. And so it needed to keep, not so much Bahrain is a sort of a small fish in this context, but it needed to keep Saudi and the Emiratis on side for that. And of course, it felt it needed to sell Saudi a lot of arms. And during the Obama administration, the amount of arms sales to Saudi increased dramatically over what it had been before. So there were all these other considerations, which meant that the poor old Bahrain, or at least the poor old opposition in Bahrain, really got neglected and sort of overridden by these other, bigger concerns.
So basically, despite the fact that Bahrain has this big naval base, really sort of U.S. policy to Bahrain kind of flows via Riyadh, via Saudi Arabia, and that's the bigger concern. And so to the extent that Saudi Arabia is concerned about things in Bahrain, that's where sort of the U.S. would engage. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, Saudi is always, the not so quiet elephant in the room, and more so are the Emiratis too. And now, over the last few weeks, I think what's been very frustrating is that those doors have opened, I think, a little bit in Washington, which had been previously closed, in terms of questioning the US-Saudi relationship, or even the US-Emirati relationship. The two cases of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the jailing and since release of the British academic Matthew Hedges have raised questions in Washington I hadn't heard for the previous 5 or 6 years.
And the UAE case, just to explain, is the case of a British academic who was arrested and detained for many months in the UAE, ostensibly just for conducting his research, but he was released just a few days before recording this episode.
Right, after having the week before been sentenced to life in prison.
Yeah.
And so here you get the two sides of this dreadfully repressive regime, which obviously didn't give him a fair trial, forced confession, all that, and yet when the international community wants to make an outcry, it can have an effect. It can get the guy released. And when the international community decides it wants to make a fuss about Jamal Khashoggi, then we're going to see at least potentially some movement.
But the international community has not made a commensurate fuss about, say, was it Nabil in
Nabil Rajab? No, that's right.
And these other dissidents and bloggers and journalists who've been arrested in Bahrain. Can I ask, how has U.S. policy towards Bahrain changed under the Trump administration, or has it?
I'd say it's got a little more honest. In that the Obama administration sold billions of dollars worth of weapons to Saudi, and yet tried to talk out another side of its mouth and talk about how it was concerned so much about human rights in Bahrain. On and off, it did that. The Sham administration doesn't pretend to care at all. There are a couple of prisoners, including Nabil Rajab and the head of the opposition, Ali Salman, that the Trump administration has called for their release, which is a good thing. But generally, I don't think anyone, if they were under any misapprehension before, that really Washington was going to use its influence to try and force, or at least urge, the Bahraini ruling family to reform. The Obama administration sort of talked about doing that, but never really did it. The Trump administration isn't even talking about doing that.
So what, given the fact of the Trump administration, what can the U.S. or other international allies and partners do to press for real reform, real democratic reform in Bahrain, or at least an end to the brutal repression?
I think some of the frustration that those of us who've been arguing this in London and Washington and elsewhere, Brussels over the years, is that when you talk to a well-informed, smart government official from any of those places, they will get it. I mean, they will agree, at least to some extent, that this repressive approach is very dangerous. You may be able to keep a lid on things for a while, but then the lid is going to explode off, as we saw in 2011 in so many places. And so the logic of our argument, I think, is pretty much accepted. But the reality for the government official is, unless that's going to blow over, unless it's going to blow up and explode in the next sort of 6 or 12 months or 2 years, then we could probably keep things going as they are. So it's a very myopic outlook from the UK and the US, which I think everybody more or less agrees, is unsustainable. And so when you argue with them, look, just try and make things a little less worse. Let's have the opposition out of prison. Let's have basic stuff. Let's have some human rights activists, any of the human rights activists who were put in prison, out. Anybody who's given an unfair trial out. This is basic sort of stuff. Again, it's hard for them to argue against that. But what happens is that it gets overridden again by these either real or imaginary concerns about the need not to upset the allies there because they're part of the alliance against Iran. We need their oil. We can't afford any more disruption in the region. I mean, much of the logic, I have to say, sounds like a sort of a 1970s, 1980s Cold War Washington logic where it's okay to back Pinochet or the Shah of Iran or apartheid South Africa. Yes, it's embarrassing for us to be friends with them, but basically in the end, they're on our side against the real enemy. And so that sort of very simplistic, depressing level of diplomacy is still what's running the show in Washington and London.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for your time and for your insights. And I hope one day you're able to return to Bahrain. Thank you, Adla. I'm going to keep trying. All right. Thanks very much for this chance to talk. It's been, thanks very much. I enjoyed it a lot. All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Brian. That was very helpful. And I'll post a link to my conversation with my friend Anna Therese Day, the journalist who was arrested in Bahrain a few years ago for just doing journalism about political movements there. It's a good story she tells and an enlightening one, I think. All right, we'll see you soon. And don't forget to sign up to become a premium subscriber and support the show. I so appreciate your support. Thank you so much. You're helping to make this podcast that shines a spotlight on underreported stories, a sustainable media enterprise, of which there are sadly few around the world, but I'm hoping to make this one of them. So I so appreciate your support. All right, see you next time. Bye.